Greetings. I'm Ed Steinfeld, Director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. Welcome to today's special webinar, Mass Incarceration, a discussion with Time Director Garrett Bradley and Brown's own Nicole Gonazlez Van Cleve. I very much hope that everybody in the audience today has watched Time, Garrett Bradley's absolutely extraordinary 2020 documentary. If you haven't, it's available on Amazon. Please, please watch this film. Let me just say that today's event is part of the Watson Institute and the Brown Arts Initiative's John F. Kennedy Jr. Initiative for Documentary Film and Social Progress. Indeed, Time, the film we'll talk about today, in so many ways embodies the motivating values and aspirations of this entire initiative. It embodies our belief in the importance of film as an avenue for the search for truth and a reaffirmation of the importance of human dignity. It embodies our belief in the vibrancy of the intersection of the arts and journalism and scholarship. And it certainly embodies our faith in the power of narrative in addressing the great human challenges and great human injustices of our time. We're so fortunate today to be joined by two just absolutely exceptional individuals. First, please allow me to introduce Garrett Bradley, the director of Time. Garrett's first feature film was Below Dreams, which premiered at the 2014 Tribeca Film Festival and won the Special Jury Award at the New Orleans Film Festival. Garrett's 2017 short film Alone, again, fantastic, won the Short Form Jury Award in nonfiction at the Sundance Film Festival. And her 2019 short film America has won widespread acclaim in many different media outlets. And for her 2020 feature film, Time, Garrett won the award for Best Director for U.S. Documentary at Sundance. I'm equally pleased to introduce to you my colleague, our colleague, Nicole Gonazlez Van Cleve, Associate Professor of Sociology here at Brown. Nicole is a world-renowned scholar of race and racism, particularly as those intersect with criminal justice, law, and incarceration. Her book, Crook County, Racism and Injustice in America's Largest Criminal Court, has won multiple awards, including the American Sociological Association's Distinguished Book Prize. And her phenomenal new book, The Waiting Room, focusing on the Cook County Jail, focuses on the broad societal effects of pretrial incarceration across families and entire communities. You'll see across the film Time and Nicole's work, there is this just incredible and profound examination of the phenomenon of time and waiting. Welcome to you both, Garrett and Nicole, and thank you so much for joining us. To those of you in the audience, let me just say, Garrett, Nicole, and I are going to have a conversation for minutes to maybe 25 minutes, and then we'll open it wide open to questions. To those of you in the audience participating via Zoom, please use the Q&A window to ask questions, and I'll monitor those and I'll get to the questions that way. For those of you watching on YouTube Live, you can also ask questions on YouTube, and then those questions will be relayed to me. Start asking questions now. We'll get to them soon. Let me just begin, Garrett, by saying your film, for me personally, was breathtaking and heartbreaking, and in some ways I've trouble describing, inspiring in a lot of ways. In focusing on the story of Sybil Fox Richardson and her children, you created, at least for me, such just a profound sense of loss and pain, but also, I mean, unbelievable love and determination. And by using the home videos that Fox had shot for years across her children's entire lives, you create such a profound sense of time, one that made me as a parent cry frequently in the course of the film, or maybe just as a human being cry. But going into the film, could you talk a little bit about, even before you got access to Fox's own videos, what did you hope to achieve going into this film, even before you had the additional material that Fox provided you?
Yeah, well, first, I just want to say thank you for having me. I'm so honored to be here, especially with Brown University and all of you in such a sort of distinguished space. And I know that there's many brilliant souls that are watching us right now, so thanks for joining. I think for me personally, it's really important to ask questions before you start a project. And, the reason why questions I think are so important, sometimes even, questions in many cases are even more important than answers themselves in terms of how we think about a value system in our culture. And for me, I think the reason for that is it allows you to create real equal ground with the people that you're working with. It's really, the average person is not going to be comfortable with the camera being with them 24/7, right? So if one is open to the possibility of it, that must mean that they feel that they have something to say, something they can share, something they want to contribute to the world that's important. And as a filmmaker, it's really important for me to know what that is. Essentially what the intention is, because that intention is then for me what informs the aesthetic and the entire approach to how the film is made. And so when I posed this question to Fox and to the family, including Robert, even though he wasn't physically with us, why do you want to make this film? Why is it worth us embarking on this journey together? As a stranger, essentially, right? I had met Fox previously in making another film, but this would have been a pretty intimate process. And their response was they felt that their story is the story of 2.3 million other American families, and that in sharing their story, they would offer hope, right? And hope is something that is critical, but can also be vague. And so it was my job to then try to think about, well, what does hope look like in the specificity of this story and with this family? And I really was approaching it again without, as you said, the knowledge of the archive, of trying to indicate at a bare bones minimum how the system entangles itself unequivocally in the daily life of incarcerated families, that you cannot separate the system from anything you do moment to moment. And so I really tried to keep my focus there, and it was really, I think, documentary filmmaking, but certainly with this film in particular, it was so much about focusing and honoring the present, in the process of shooting. I think to a certain extent, it becomes kind of unethical, right? If you try to anticipate or imagine, even as a documentary filmmaker, what the outcome is going to be or what the ending is going to be. So all you have is honoring the present moment. And that is what I was focusing on.
Fantastic. Nicole, I'm curious what your reaction to the film is, particularly because it intersects with so many issues that you look at in your work.
So, for me, walking into the criminal justice system the first time, seeing a courtroom, seeing a jail, I remember there, one of the ongoing themes that I always would write about, whether I was researching in Crook County and then following up on it in the waiting room, was this idea of the currency of time. And that criminal justice actors are constantly playing, if you will, with time. And it's an important currency that, if we think about it, someone said, just kind of talking philosophically, my friend Zandria Robinson said, Nicole, all you have is your time. And when you strip the world away and think about that really, as human beings, we have this finite amount of time, and that the greatest punishment is to take those years away and then deny it. The punishment then extends not just to the incarcerated person or the person that did the crime, but we can see that in the movie, which was so beautifully illustrated, that it is a web that extends way beyond the one person. And, sociologists like Armando Larmian and Javier Ayero, they talk about the politics of waiting. And that waiting is, for the marginalized, a way that the state can temporarily neglect or unattend to or postpone attending to an enormous amount of people. It's a politics of subordination. And one of the things that I talk about in Crook County is, but there's two sides to the waiting, right? There are those who do the waiting, and there are those who create the conditions of waiting. And so I thought one of the things that was really important in this movie is that we saw that someone on the other line of the phone, usually a bureaucratic person, sometimes it seemed as though another African-American person, was almost a gatekeeper to access justice, right? The waiting and waiting on the phone, the waiting with lawyers only to get a memo, the waiting, right? It just kept going. And I think, we don't think of punishment. We think of punishment on the body, right? We think of like the burden of sitting in a cell. But I think when you distill it to its most, basic level, it is that sense of waiting and the depletion of time and the not knowing when it will relent. And I think, to me, the one thing we see here is the humanity and the inhumanity of those politics. What we don't get to see as much, and I hope as social scientists we really get to reveal, are those actors that actually create these arrangements, that in some ways mistreat, neglect, ignore, hang up on, dismiss. I think that, to me, was the extra layer of suffering that I think was very much palpable.
Garrett, can you talk a little bit more about, on the one hand, how you are able to just so profoundly depict this kind of eroding, wearing down qualities of time on Fox and on others as well? I mean, I think Fox describes just this weight that's constantly on her of waiting for the days to go by. At the same time, there's all this very positive investment in time in her children, and positive investment in the fight for her husband, but so much positive sense of time and progress in her investment in her children. Can you talk a little bit about whether I've got it right, but also how you were able to create that truth?
Well, I think that when I'm working with people, I mean, there's a few kind of basic parameters for me as a filmmaker that are really important. One is that I'm not seeing the people I'm working with as subjects, right? That I'm really it is, and I'm also not seeing their shared experience with me as access to anything. I think there are certain forms of terminology that create certain power dynamics and a certain apparent neutrality or objectivity that I as a filmmaker am not that interested in. What I'm really interested in is connecting with people, connecting with individuals, and celebrating the individual's spirit. You know, I think in all of my work, I am drawn to a person, right? Before I am even the issue, before sometimes what the film even becomes. And I think that, with this film, I was very much thinking about, how do I continue the conversation of incarceration from a sort of Black feminist point of view, from a familial point of view, but also from, I think as Nicole so beautifully talked about, from the effects of the facts, And that was something that I inadvertently found myself doing in the process of making Alone, which was the precursor to Time, which is a 13-minute film. And I met Fox in the process of making that film. And it was really about, how do I continue this journey? And the way in which I do that is to see a person for who they are. And I think that in order to make something intimate, and as you say, beautiful, which I really deeply appreciate, what you're seeing is the beauty of the people that I'm working with. It's the beauty and the spirit of those that are in front of the camera. And it's my job, I feel, to evoke that, to translate that, to channel it visually, and using techniques of cinema, with sound, with camera, with light, with movement.
There are just so many different aspects of human dignity in this film, again, that left me speechless. But can you talk a little bit about Fox's mom? I found her so compelling, but also kind of confusing, and in some ways are hard for me to fully reconcile, because she too expresses the racialized quality of all of this pain and the waiting and the burden at the same time. And she's proud, I sense, proud of her daughter, but also judging her, sort of judging her daughter, or maybe disappointed in her daughter with I think she says, or, maybe Riley, but you do the crime, whatever, you do the time. She knows her daughter has wronged, and seeing her wrestle with that, with her love, I found very compelling, but also maybe with lots of question marks after it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think to talk about incarceration in our country, it becomes an intergenerational conversation, because you're dealing with the systematic separation of brown and black people from the inception of the New World, from the beginning of this country. And so every generation has dealt with the same issue. It now looks like the prison system instead of, historical examples of the enslavement of people. And it's the same situation with the loan. In order to tell a story, you inevitably bring in the parents, and the children. Again, as Nicole, I think, pointed out. And, I think that when you love somebody so much, when your child makes decisions that are not the decisions that you would make, which is just what it is to be a parent, I think, and I'm not a parent, but that's what it is, right? You have to reconcile with those choices. And I think that Miss Peggy's advice was a reflection of how her generation would have dealt with that situation. And Fox's approach was a reflection of her generation's decision. And likewise, Freedom and the Sons, you see their generation's response again to the same situation. So I think actually it's a reflection that goes over the course of 3 generations in the film, which we would be remiss not to include because it's such a crucial and inevitable part of the conversation of what it means to be an incarcerated family.
Nicole, can you talk a little bit about some of the intergenerational aspects in your work?
Yeah, I guess that, for me, the grandmother was kind of a voice of experience and wisdom. One of the most uncomfortable things that I have to tell people sometimes is to explain to them the kind of racist assumptions that the system and its actors often harbor. So one of the profound moments, I thought, was when the grandmother said, "You can't dress like that when you walk into the court. You can't act like that. They already think the worst of you." And she's in some ways narrating through her deep experience of being labeled and stigmatized in the ways that she's, with all her many years of experience. And she's trying to convey that to her daughter. By the time her daughter is on the phone, shaking her fist at the person that won't even answer, put a call in, right, is wasting more time for her husband. I think she's there. To me, it was like the full circle. You get to see the naivete to a certain extent on the one end, and then you see the realization on the other. And I think that, one of the things that I strive to do in my research is I remember hearing people talking on the subway, two African-American men talking about how they were mistreated by the system and the kind of racist ways that the judge talked to them, belittled them, told them to pick up their pants. They were ignored by their public defender. They were demeaned. They talked about abuse in the jail. And I was overhearing this conversation. And I said to them, "You know more about this system than most of the researchers that are willing to admit." And when you collect data and research and observations on these criminal justice actors, they are mocking people in Ebonics. They are exhibiting enormous amounts of cruelty in the jails. They're making families wait for no reason. In my research, I saw it was 3 court watchers looking at one incident where an African-American child was playing with a cell phone. She was about 15, and the mother was sitting right next to her. And they took the child into custody without even telling the mother to please have your child stop this, or giving just a warning. And so you hear this child wailing in the back in the lockup while the mother's in the gallery, and the sheriffs and the prosecutors are laughing as though it's a joke. I mean, to me, it's the historical replaying. I mean, that I can imagine a Black mother in the time of lynching weeping and crying and wailing in the same way as her son was taken off or taken away from her. I think, to me, that is the profound level of racism and abuse that people are experiencing. And it's, to me, she felt like the truth teller. It's like her daughter wasn't there yet, but she would be. And that was particularly powerful because I often don't hear that narrative. And I think we too often will doubt her voice as being, if we're researchers, oh, well, that's not empirical, but she's speaking a truth that I think we need to take very seriously. And we shouldn't have to collect data on how people experience prejudice and power in real life. And I think that's what art gives us, is we can take her word for it and we can grieve with her and listen to her wisdom and hopefully think differently about the system as she sees it.
And Garrett, I was also really taken by the the church and the other kinds of well, just community associations and services that, of course, don't make up for loss, but somehow allow people to keep on living, rich, a lot of community help. Can you talk a little bit about the role of the church in Fox's activities, her family's activities, but also my sense was that Fox's experience, her family's experience, it wasn't an uncommon one in that church community.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think so much of the history of the church is just as much as religion as it is about community and people being able to support each other when an entire nation and a government are not there to do that with you, right? Um, I think that for Fox, what was equally as important for her was the church of family, and how she kept her sons close, and how Miss Peggy stepped in to support um, maintaining a level of unification for that family, knowing what the system could have done to completely dismantle them. And I think I just can't emphasize enough that I think, what it means to hold on to a family over the course of 21 years is significant. And it is unfortunately very common. It's a part of our nation's experience. It's become an American experience, through and through.
I had a very different feeling watching some of the just the apologies and the atonement for sin or for wrongdoing. It's certain that a crime occurred, right? But as a sociologist, I'm seeing that crime occur as a desperation. You see that in the courts all the time, mothers stealing jackets and baby formula, poor folks stealing hats. I saw a man when I was studying or researching for the waiting room, he stole a winter hat and was incarcerated for 43 days. And a prayer group found him, they released him from jail, and at 4 a.m. they found him sleeping by a dumpster. And they woke him up and helped him, and laying next to him from that dumpster was a hat. And he went through all that punishment and desperation over it, right? So to me, I was seeing it from a different lens. And I think one of the gaslighting things that happen is that, this system makes people continue to apologize and atone and atone and atone. And the amount of emotional energy that you go through. And in my own family, my Auntie Martha was in a kind of a rehabilitation style church like that. And some of the churches themselves were particularly punitive, and that you had to continue to be apologetic, but very little acknowledgement to the types of suffering that was created by social inequality, hardships, over policing of neighborhoods, and all the things that created those conditions. So you end up, even though you're highly aware, and I felt this way, everyone was highly aware of how abusive the system could be, but yet that profound apology over and over again. To me, as a viewer, I'm like, you've done enough. You've apologized enough. What more can you do? To me, I almost wanted it to stop. It was like an additional layer of pain, that a suffering that continued to endure, that was very deeply personal.
Yeah, we'll turn to the audience's questions in a moment. Garrett, I also want to ask you, this is on the subject of Fox's, I don't know whether it's fierce, but I mean, just her unbelievable and unyielding love for her family. And by most people's standards, her incredible success. I mean, her children, they're just unbelievably successful and beautiful and all, everything. Did you worry at all, or do you worry at all that a message from the film will be that as long as people are determined, they can overcome anything, or that the system is really unjust, but it's like the American self-help story. You just lift your stuff up by your bootstraps, and yes, you too will have children who become dentists and professionals. Is there that risk, I guess?
I mean, I think that's the role of the artist to a certain extent, is to take risks, you know? I mean, you can't control how something will be ultimately taken once it's brought into the world. I think it's more about what's important to you and why are you saying it and how are you saying it, right? And really being able to understand your own methodology and why you're doing something. You know, this idea of Black exceptionalism as being being both a form of oppression and resistance is also a part of the American journey, you know? And I think that it isn't so much about everyone needing to be like the family that we see in this film, as much as it is, I hope, a matter of identifying almost quotidian, everyday, seemingly mundane forms of resistance. And what that means is love, right? Unity. How do you stay close to those that you care about? How do you hold on to your individuality within a system that is intended to break that down? These are things that I think are just as important as other forms of resistance and other forms of protest that are perhaps more visible. Being on the street, for instance, being involved in legislation, being involved in voting, these are all really important things. But what are some other equally as accessible modalities and ways of existing that also can resist and counteract what the system is doing, you know? So that's my hope, you know?
Yeah. Thank you for that answer. But why don't we just turn to some questions? And again, all of you in the audience, please ask your questions. So Nicole Pesquin, pardon me if I mispronounced your name, Nicole, writes, "Hi, I love the film. One of the most compelling symbols for me was the cardboard cutout of Rob Rich. Could you speak to how that symbol came about and why you chose to feature it?"
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of people have cardboard cutouts of loved ones that have either passed or that, in Robert's case, are incarcerated. I think the reason why it's so crucial goes to this question of erasure and invisibility. And I think also reinforces, for me as a filmmaker and as an artist, the importance of, in this present moment, creating as many optics around the issue as we can. Because part of what we saw this summer was an incredible outpouring and unprecedented amount of white allyship for the movement, right? And a lot of that being connected to visibility of what was happening. And for me, it only illuminates the lack of visibility that we see around incarceration. And I think, Nicole, you were speaking to this earlier, that is by design, that not being able to see the system and those that are controlling it, even all the way down to the physical space of Angola, which is where Robert was for 21 years. For those who don't know, Angola was made up of multiple plantations that were nicknamed after the people that were enslaved from the country of Angola. It was then consolidated into a single plantation and turned into a prison, which is 18,000 acres of land. So even our drone was only able to get a fraction of what the magnitude is, the amount of space that's being invested to incarcerate people, right? And if we think again about 2.3 million people that are incarcerated, the fact, which is equally as important, can become in itself very abstract, right? How do you fathom that? So visibility and proof of the things that are being strategically removed are incredibly important. And I tried to hint at them and to address them as best I could within the limitations that definitely exist in the film.
Nicole, do you want to talk a little bit about this whole issue of invisibility?
Yeah, I think that, people, for me, access is always one way that the system itself, it kind of depends upon people not being there. And, from my own research, if I sent in 130 court watchers to look at the Chicago court system, and they were dressed in plain clothes. So they were law students and highly educated people of different races. And they, the white researchers in particular were always singled out because the attorneys were like, who are you? What are you doing here looking at this space, right? They saw them as a threat. Whereas, Black researchers were mistaken for defendants, in a way that really exposed how racial divides were part of the definition of the system. But to me, that was one of the, it really put this light bulb on in my head, which is man, this system exists this way because, because it's in secret, right? And we don't think of America as having secret courts, right? It's supposed to be open and accessible, but that's really not the case. And I think that to me, any way we can break those walls down is a really important exercise. And that's why I try to kind of, constantly break those walls down. The Cook County Jail is 96 acres, which is the equivalent of 72 American football fields. So I can't do the math as quickly in my head, but if you think about Angola stretching even bigger, even that enormity, that's pretrial incarceration, meaning the people that are held there they are charged, but they're not found guilty yet. They're just a group of potentially innocent people that are then kind of forced to plead guilty to get to end the punishment, right? So punishment is always kind of a part of it. And, in the Cook County Jail, the clandestine nature of that space, that people walk by these big walls every day. They live next door to the jail. Like, there's literally homes and small bungalows that are next to the walls of the jail. People leave the jail bloodied and wounded, being jumped by local gangs and violence. And yet we cannot really see and access it. And that sheriff is considered a reformer. And so I think as many artists and social scientists and academics need to really take down these walls to continue to expose what's going on. And I think doing that from multiple vantage points is really important, right? Sometimes putting the lens on those who are creating these conditions, and then sometimes showing the suffering and how it's impacting ordinary people.
Garrett, I have a follow-up question actually to the question that was just asked in the chat window. So Fox she just developed this huge archive, it seemed, of film. And could you talk a little bit about how that came about and what maybe how you understand Fox's intentions in so intimately documenting the lives of her children?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, Bell Hooks talks a lot about the importance of the Black Family Archive, as it in many cases being the only evidence of ourselves as we see ourselves in the world. When you don't have examples of that in mainstream society. And so I think that, for Fox, it was the function of self-documentation and family documentation took on multiple forms. On one hand, it was probably therapy. It was something that was for her. It was also a form of resistance. It was also, in many cases, I think, a way of empowering her children, her sons, to be curious and to be confident about how to see and move through the world. Some of my favorite moments in the archive are Remington and Lawrence holding the camera, and her explaining to them how to hold the camera and how to frame things. That's powerful information, I think, to arm a child with. And so I think that ultimately there were so many different functions that the archive ended up, offering. It was in many ways addressing the American dream, which was the same thing that ultimately got them in the situation that they were in, right? It was a sort of recreating this idea of what a wholesome family is, recreating new images and symbols around what that can look like, which is something that, again, we have to do for ourselves. Otherwise, other people are going to do that for us, right? But it also, I think, in the context of a film, in the context of two-dimensional space, and being limited to telling a story one frame at a time, really offered a sort of 360-degree experience into a life that is otherwise very difficult to show.
Yeah, I'm still speechless just thinking about so many of those scenes. Nicole, could you talk a little bit about some of your work in archiving, really, the experiences of the incarcerated, but also all of those who are affected as the ripples go outward into the family and the community?
So, I think I'm in a new era of my scholarship where I keep thinking about ways to capture or break down the walls and capture the insights of incarcerated people. And it happened when I went to the Graterford prison, which is in Pennsylvania. And there you will meet people that are serving life sentences, many times for a charge called felony murder, which means that you might be a young person, you're with your older brother or an older classmate or person in your neighborhood, and you drive the car and they go to rob a liquor store. And if someone dies within that exchange, you serve life, even though you didn't pull the trigger. And a lot of people, grown men who were in their 40s or 50s, had been serving these excruciating sentences. And I think, to me, the one thing that, when we think about time, we also think of like a wasting away. And what I want to say, though, and from what I learned, is that many incarcerated people are scholars and activists, and they are doing more with their lives than people on the outside. And I think that was a palpable feeling for me. Graterford had an organization called the Think Tank. And these were men that got BAs and in some cases MAs from Villanova University. And they were critiquing policy and engaging in ways that were just, to me, it made me profoundly sad, because I felt like if they were outside the world, they could really impact the world in a deeper way. And so now one thing that I'm trying to do is create a humanities lab here at Brown, where we are going to document mass incarceration from the inside out. We are going to give a voice and center the views of incarcerated people. They're going to steer the archive. They're going to tell us what needs to be in it. We're going to curate it. And part of it too was this kind of personal thing, as I was getting all these responses, prison letters, where people were critiquing my book or had thoughtful ideas about something I said on NPR. And I wanted those to be preserved. What other way can we do that? And so we're trying to do that, because I think when we see the release, right, and you see this wise man coming out of prison, I mean, I felt like his wisdom was like so profound. I don't know what, Garrett, what your sense was, but he was a man that had studied and grown and was spiritual and educated. And gosh, I was thinking, well, if he was released so much earlier, think of the impact, not just for his family, but if given a chance. And yet the system disenfranchised people from voting and from going back to school, getting grants in type of financial aid to go back to school. Some jailhouse lawyers cannot be practicing lawyers once they're outside, even if they've exonerated themselves or others. So we do everything in our power as a country and as a system to stop that flourishing. And so, Garrett, I don't know if since you've lived through it and saw the profound change, can you speak to that? Because that's what I observed, and that's why I felt like I had to chronicle the stories from on the inside and find an outlet for these scholars who happen to be in prison.
Yeah. I mean, Robert, though, in my opinion, even though I didn't know him 21 years ago, was a wise, intelligent, beautiful, warm person then as well, and that people find themselves entangled in the system. And there are very concrete strategies that make it very difficult to get out. And I think that this question of forgiveness, this question of making a mistake, right? Who gets to make a mistake? Who doesn't get to make a mistake? That's really what this is about. It's not really about anyone's character. The reflection of those that are incarcerated right now has nothing to do with good people or bad people. It has to do with a system that is trying to replace the connection between capitalism and the enslavement of millions of people. It's just it's a different approach to the same goal.
Garrett, what were the circumstances of Robert's release? It wasn't really totally clear to me from the film.
So he was released through clemency. And that's something that Fox and Rob are actively engaged in New Orleans. They run a participatory defense organization that has several chapters throughout the country. And I think that's something that I think it also goes back to, like, as a filmmaker, how when you're working with people in an equal way to make a film, it's really important that they also have the space to move an issue forward and to talk from their own personal experience. I think for me, what's been important is to talk about the film and how we can create as many, I think, as Nicole said, many different entry points to the same issue as possible. I think that even though this is a film that doesn't focus so much on the facts, right? It's really more about the effects, as I said. It still very much stands on the shoulders of a film like 13th, right? That these two need to coexist with one another. And so that...
Oh, I'm sorry, Garrett.
No, I was just going to say it's important that they run simultaneous to one another.
Well, I also wanted to know, he didn't accept the plea bargain, so then the assumption is that he went to trial. Is that correct?
Yes.
Correct.
Yeah.
Because that's an important lesson. Like, I feel like I need to pause as an academic here. We say we get the right to a trial, but let's be very clear. If you go to trial, bench, and then even escalate it to a jury, you will be punished accordingly. And I think you have attorneys advising clients and say, if you don't accept this plea, you're going to get 60 years, 100, I can't save you from that. And the person's like, no, 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 this system is fair. This system is going to exonerate me. I will be seen as free if I go to trial. And we are so taught within school systems, within our constitution, within our, with even just the Hollywood and the painting of this picture. If you're innocent, then you'll be found not guilty. And I think we know that that's not true. And I think it's important for us to just pause for 2 seconds to say, one of the reasons he was punished was because he exercised his rights. And for that, he needed 60 years and not 12. And to me, that is another level of crime in this whole thing. It's terrible.
Yes. And I recall Fox's mom, Miss Peggy, makes that point, maybe more equivocally in some ways, but it notes that he could have taken the plea. And again, it's just that emphasis on how much time that cost.
And I think the one important point is, it's hard because we talk about, well, he was guilty, so, you should have just not gone to trial. But, I think of it the other way too, is all the people that we understand as being incarcerated through mass incarceration. If you're incentivizing people through these terrible punishments, if they get a trial, you are encouraging people to plead guilty to crimes that they did not commit. And now that we have so truly exposed how policing occurs on the streets in Black and brown communities and the level of violence, I have been asking my students, what if George Floyd survived? He would have been found guilty and be serving a sentence for a very small crime, but with a level of abuse that routed him into the system. And that should be, unsavory and unacceptable to all of us. And I think that that's an important point. Is we talk about mass incarceration, but in my work, I've been starting to call it, mass wrongful conviction, because we do not know the scale once we have these levers that we can pull upon people where they're forced to accept those pleas. There really isn't a choice. It's just do it or else. And we can see what happened. This is the story of or else. It's a cautionary horror story for anyone who thinks that the courts are going to actually give you a fair trial.
We have another question from the audience. This comes from our colleague at Watson and the Department of Sociology, Professor Jayanti Owens. And Jayanti asks or notes, thanks for this really insightful conversation around such an important topic. Garrett made the point earlier about not seeing her work as involving research subjects. But this is language that we as researchers are trained to use, often with the aim of protecting the rights and identities of those who participate in our research. Do you think using terms like, quote, research subjects, unquote, runs the risk of othering the people who agree to participate in our research? If so, how would you encourage us to think about research subjects instead? If not, can you say more about how we as researchers should think about the distinction you made earlier?
That's a great question, and thank you for that. I don't want to sort of prescribe a universal way in which one should do their work, because I think that it's nuanced, right? But I find, speaking from my own experience, that part of why we are making films, we're doing research, we're writing books, is to contribute something, right? Is to heal, is to try to create more justice, and justice both on a sort of profound, large, universal scale, but also, I would hope, at least for myself, for the individual, for the person to a certain extent that I am intimately involved with. And so I don't actually see it as something that's too different from therapy, and I think transparency is a huge part of that. So it's not so much a matter, I don't put labels on it when I'm working. I'm a filmmaker, Fox, Rob, all the sons, you are who you are as individuals, right? And we are working together. And my intention is to make a film, to do X, Y, and Z, right? And so in order for us to accomplish this goal that we've decided on together from the very, very beginning, right? When it goes back to that question, why do you want to do this? Then you're working hand in hand, right? And things are going to come up, questions are going to come up. And I can't imagine, and I don't know, but I'd be really curious actually to find out that that's maybe too different from working with research subjects, right? Where you approach somebody, hopefully you're transparent about what it is that you intend to do with this information, why it's important, and ultimately how it can help them, right? Because why would somebody participate in something if it wasn't going to contribute to something that was important to them and in their immediate life? So I think the terminology, you know, I'm reluctant to say what that terminology should be, but I personally find that language around the subject and around access goes back to a certain approach to documentary filmmaking that was deeply problematic and exploitative and not about transparency at all.
I was going to say, you know, for me, it's a little different because the subjects that I focus on, my lens is on the power brokers, the officers. And, you know, I'll give you an example. I worked in researching for the waiting room. I spent hours around the Cook County jail at all hours, just watching people be released, sitting with families. I walk into the Cook County jail and there's a guard on duty. I give him a business card. I tell him exactly what I'm doing, that I'm, you know, doing a story and I'm looking at these issues of the history of the Cook County jail and release processes. And within minutes, there is a sheriff who is telling me he knows about torture within the jail, techniques of torture, and he's bragging about it. And, you know, I think the hard part for me is that I don't know. I mean, to me, he is my subject because it isn't a healing. I can't think of it that way because I'm studying these powerful brokers that have normalized these practices to the extent that they brag about them and they don't feel guarded about concealing it. So people ask me, well, how do you get people to say this? I'm like, I just listen. I ask them a question and I let them elaborate on it. And I do not judge it because I am a witness. So I consider myself, I'm witnessing this, and then I'm going to report back on it rather than interfere with it. But it's hard. I'm just curious because I'm so compelled by Professor Owen's question because it's important. And you brought up you know, because I understand the language, because if you're studying marginalized people who have been marginalized, it's really important nuance. What do we call it when we're studying really powerful people that often abuse their power?
And Nicole, I think that's a really interesting distinction that I'm going to be thinking about for like days. I feel like there's so much to think about, but I also wonder, like, do you feel like you get to the step where they themselves are asking themselves why they do what they do? Like, and does that feed into the question of then how they're seeing themselves in relationship to you?
I think once I get to that part and they peel away the layers, I you know, my assumption is that most people, the people maintaining the system, the people that are working as guards, you know, no one goes home and says, you know, today I subjugated people, today I tortured people and feel really good about that. Instead, they create what I call sincere fictions, which is how do I make sense of this world and still feel good about what I do? And to me, that starts to reveal larger issues about theories of racism and creating an other that's so different from who you are, right? I keep thinking, well, how are we get to a point where the Trump administration could cage kids and not see that as like anti-life? Like, how are those things? Well, if you've coded the children as not being, you know, as other, then you can do a lot of egregious harm. It gets almost back to issues of human rights. And, you know, so I'm continuing to think about that. I guess for me, I keep just going deeper and investigating more. And I think about what are these larger theories that this perpetuates? Because, you know, why would that officer feel so great about bragging about torture? When the story came out, he wanted to recant what he said. And, you know, and it was on, I mean, it was on film, it was on, you know, there's cameras everywhere in a jail. Like, you can't deny that, you know, but I think that's really hard. I think this is such a great dialogue because it is, how do we get away from using subjects? But then what is it when we're studying power? And I don't know.
Garrett, can you talk a little bit about how your film, I mean, I know it hasn't been out very long, but how and to what extent has it opened up new kinds of conversations or empowered people who might not otherwise have had the opportunity or the inclination to engage in conversations or tell their own stories?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been a funny time to release the film because, we don't have typically, even in the community screenings that we're doing outside of film festivals, but actually in neighborhoods and in spaces that we are really targeting, that we feel like are really important, right? It's important for me that incarcerated families see this film. That is who this film is for, as far as I'm concerned, right? It's when you're just screening something on the internet and maybe you do a Q&A, maybe you don't, it's a little bit hard to know how it's resonating with people. So social media has been kind of a godsend to a certain extent, and being able to see how it's reaching people. And I think that I'm excited for the future of the film. I hope that the film over time can continue to be, a place of solace, and I kind of lost track a little bit of the intention of your question again, but it was
No, that's right. No, that's exactly right. And of course I want people to see the film, but I imagine though that the film is encouraging people to tell their stories, and not to hide their story, but to tell their stories and tell their stories across, different communities.
I hope so. I mean, but yes, there's that. And I also hope, I mean, the thing that's so ironic to me, I've had multiple people come to me and say that it wasn't until sort of the last scene in the film that they realized how much time had gone by and how unjust the system was. And and basically what the privilege of intimacy is, that's something we take for granted on the outside. And so for me, that was a sort of moment of saying, wow, there are so many different entry points from which people are going to allow themselves to hear and to understand what's actually happening, and so I think that's to be seen, I think it's to be seen. Yeah.
I was wondering too, I mean, there was a sense of tension for me because as someone who studies mass incarceration, and I've called reentry a false promise. I think the whole the idea of reentry is that it is just not possible when you have so many laws pushing people back into the system. I saw a tragic case where a man was waiting for a bus stop, and it was a cold night, so he stood under like an awning at a store in Chicago, and the police arrest him. They arrest him and he's sitting there waiting for the bus. So they say he's violating his probation because he was on the store's property and not in the public way. And I mean, to me, it was like, people cannot cut a break. And so there is part of me that feels like this story might not be over. Mm-hmm. And that's terrifying because I want it to be over. I want it to end with this happy, upbeat ending, that there is this sense of hope and love. But I also know that the system is incredibly predatory and it continues to over police. And that makes me frightened because he's still a very vulnerable man, and being on parole is not, and then dealing with the psychological trauma of all those years incarcerated. It's almost a false promise to say that you just leave and walk away and everything's okay. And it's not. You're making up for lost time. And so sometimes people's decisions are very rash once you leave.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think that this is one family story, and I think that Robert's reentry process is very unique. I mean, he had a ride home from the minute he was released. He had an apartment to go to. He had a family. He had a job. I mean, he's still on parole for another 40 years of his life, right? With the curfew. So you're right, it doesn't end. But again, I don't think that and I think that this is part of the challenge of just making something, right? And I think it's why I actually made the film, was that when I made Alone, I got very fearful that one woman's approach to navigating the system would become the monolithic experience for how everybody maneuvers through the system. And that couldn't be further from the truth, that there is such a diversification of experience, and not, also to your point, right? That when you make something, you are, to a certain extent, you want to try to do it in a way that doesn't necessarily say this is the end all be all, or this is definitive, that this is something that is hopefully both specific enough for you at least to connect with it and to understand hopefully something that you didn't before.
Yeah, Nicole, it's interesting you say that, because as the film concluded, I had exactly the same feeling of, oh, please, please, please let this work for this family. And then, of course, for people in the audience who haven't seen the film, I won't spoil the ending, but then the absolutely beautiful way you finished the film, Garrett, still is stuck in my head visually. We have reached the end of our hour, but Garrett Bradley, I want to thank you for joining us in this conversation, and thank you for such an incredible film. And Nicole Gonazlez Van Cleve, I want to thank you for the incredible scholarship you do. And what a privilege for me and for all of us in the audience to be in this conversation today with you both.
This was an honor. Thank you for your work, Garrett. It's a wonderful.
Well, thank you for your work. I hope we can meet in person one day.
Oh, I would so love it if you could come visit us on campus, Garrett. And to those in the audience who haven't seen the film, please see it, and please encourage your friends, your family, encourage everybody to see the film.